Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I am Gary Machuda, and in this episode, we're going to take a look at the Aquila translation. This mysterious text is sometimes brought up as a defeater to the Catholic and Orthodox Old Testament canon, in that the Aquila text omits the Deuterocanonical books, or as Protestants call it, the Apocrypha books. But is this text really a foe of the longer canon, or is it an ally? Well, that's what we're going to look at today on the Apocrypha Apocalypse. So fasten your seatbelts because the apocalypse begins right now. Okay, the Aquila translation, what exactly is it? Well, to give us some basic background information, let's go to the Jewish Encyclopedia under the article of Aquila and see what it has to say.
Translator of the canonical scriptures from Hebrew into Greek. He was by birth a Gentile from Pontus, and is said by Epiphanius to have been a connection by marriage of the Emperor Hadrian, and to have been appointed by him, about the year 128, to an office concerned with the rebuilding of Jerusalem, as Aelia Capitolina. At some unknown age he joined the Christians, but afterward left them and became a proselyte to Judaism. According to Jerome, he was a disciple of Rabbi Akiba. The Talmud states that he finished his translations under the influence of Rabbi Akiba, and that his other teachers were Eleazar ben Hyrcanus and Joshua ben Hananiah. It is certain, however, that Aquila's translation had appeared before the publication of Irenaeus' Adversus Heresies, that is before 177.
So Aquila was pagan. He became Christian and eventually got kicked out of Christianity, excommunicated. This is according to Epiphanius the Salamis. And ultimately, he converts to Judaism, and as a proselyte to Judaism, sits under Rabbi Akiba, one of the most important figures in the early church and the beginnings of rabbinic Judaism, probably one of the most influential figures. He makes a translation of the scriptures from the Hebrew into Greek. And as I mentioned in the introduction, it only includes the books that rabbinic Bibles today include, and also Protestant Bibles, only the proto-canonical books. And as I mentioned before, sometimes Aquila text is thrown out in debates or in articles as evidence against the Deuterocanon. People say, see, here's a very early list. And indeed, it certainly is early. It was written sometime between 128 and 177 AD. And it doesn't include the Deuterocanon or the so-called Apocrypha. So this is often deduced as evidence. But as you know, if you watch the videos on this channel, there's often more to the story. And indeed, what we find is the Aquila translation is a very odd one in that it adheres very strictly to the Hebrew. In fact, it adheres so strictly to the Hebrew that it ignores basic Greek grammar. And so the Greek of the Aquila translation is terrible. And the reason for that is because it slavishly follows the Hebrew. As Burkhardt also notes,
the depth of his Hebrew knowledge is more open to question, if judged by modern standards. But it is the special merit of Aquila's renderings that they represent, with great fidelity, the state of Hebrew learning in his own day. Aquila, in a sense, was not the sole and independent author of his version, its uncompromising literalism being the necessary outcome of his Jewish teachers' system of exegesis.
Okay, so the Aquila translation reflects the views of the Jewish teachers, the systems of exegesis that they used. It's found in the Aquila text, and this should give us a clue as to what exactly is the Aquila text and what's its evidentiary value in terms of the canon. Well, as we've noted, Jerome, Epiphanius also point that Aquila was a disciple of Rabbi Akiba. And if you've watched this channel, in fact, we've done several videos on Akiba. I believe there's good circumstantial evidence to show that Akiba was a mover and shaker behind the new rabbinic canon that excluded the Deuterocanonical books. And definitely check out those videos when you get a chance and you could get the background. But in the meantime, let's focus a little bit just as a review on Akiba and how it relates to the Aquila text. So for this, there's actually a website called the akibafoundation.org. And I found a couple of nifty short articles that I thought would be really good for this video. In one article, it talks about Akiba's hermeneutic system. Now, hermeneutics is basically a method of interpretation. And this article describes his method of interpretation as follows.
Akiva enunciates his conviction that the mode of expression used by the Torah is quite different from that of every other book. In the language of the Torah, nothing is mere form, everything is essence. It has nothing superfluous, not a word, not a syllable, not even a letter. Every peculiarity of diction, every particle, every sign, is to be considered as of higher importance, as having a wider relation, and as being of deeper meaning than it seems to have. Akiva perceived in them indications of many important ceremonial laws, legal statutes, and ethical teachings. He thus gave the Jewish mind not only a new field for its own employment, but, convinced both of the immutability of Holy Scripture and of the necessity for development in Judaism, he succeeded in reconciling these two apparently hopeless opposites by means of his remarkable method.
So Akiba rose to prominence early in the second Christian century amongst the rabbis, the sages. As you can tell, he's a very venerated figure in Jewish history. And part of the reason is he lived at a very crucial time between the first Jewish revolt and the second Jewish revolt. During the first Jewish revolt, which culminates with the destruction of the temple in AD 70, the Jews rose up in rebellion against pagan Rome, and they met with some early success, but ultimately it failed. And this revolt was really a messianic revolt. The Zealots claimed that they were going to lead Judaism into a period of independence from Rome. Instead, it ended with catastrophe. The temple was destroyed, and all the sects that we read about in the New Testament, or I should say most of them, disappear after this point, especially sects that were tied to the temple. So first off, the Zealots pretty much disappear because they're killed off. The Sadducees, who were tied to the temple, if they survived at all, and it's possible they could have, they were largely disenfranchised because their power base was the temple. Samaritans never really were part of Judaism. They survived. So the only significant portion of the Jews, is a particular sect known as the Pharisees. The Pharisees survived relatively unscathed because they were against the revolt. The Romans knew they were against the revolt. And so when, for example, when the temple was going to be destroyed, they showed some favor to the Pharisees who were inside that were trying to escape. And one of those Pharisees, Rabbi Bezaki, made a deal with the Romans to basically allow him to set up a rabbinical school in Jamnia or Yabne. And so you probably heard of the famed, Jamnia and the so-called Council of Jamnia, which wasn't actually a council; it was a school. And it was within Jamnia that the Sanhedrin, the power of the Sanhedrin, was moved from Jerusalem to Jamnia after the destruction of the temple. It was within this period between the destruction of the temple in 70 AD and ultimately the beginning of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 AD, where Rabbi Akiba rises to prominence. And like I said, we've already done a lot of material. I don't want to go over it too much, but basically, Judaism was in a tension that needed to be resolved. It no longer had the temple. It no longer could practice the old covenant because the old covenant was tied to the sacrificial system of the temple. And so Judaism was faced with two possible options to relieve this tension. The first one is to wage a second revolt, win independence, and rebuild the destroyed temple, and then reinstitute the sacrifices, probably along Pharisaical lines, and restore that tension. And this was eventually taken. Actually, it's interesting that Akiba was behind the second revolt. He actually was a person who stumped for the leader, a certain Simon Bar Kokhba, who he believed was the Messiah prophesied in the book of Numbers. The other option was to redefine Judaism as a religion of the book. And so Akiba also takes this tack too. He begins to record in writing the oral traditions of the Jews. And there were a lot of circumstances now that Judaism faced with the destruction of the temple that even the oral tradition couldn't supply rulings on. So Akiba adopted a means of understanding or interpreting in order to draw out new rulings from the minutiae of the law. That's what we just read earlier, that basically he looked at every little jot and tittle and read vast amounts of halakhic instruction into those idiosyncrasies in the text. And this was necessary because, again, he needs some sort of biblical basis in order to change Judaism to a situation that simply the biblical text didn't foresee. And so coming out of the first Jewish revolt, you have two surviving parties. You have the Pharisees and you have the Christians. And it was this enterprise of Akiba, both to start forming Judaism along being a religion of the book and a kind of self-contained entity that's not cultic, it doesn't have a temple, and it also had to defend itself against its rival, the Christians. And this is a fairly long quote, but I think it's important to include. I found this in a very interesting work. It's called Akiba, Life, Legend, and Legacy. Its author's Hammer. And again, this is a Jewish publication, so this is not Catholic or anything like that. But look at what Hammer has to say about Akiba.
By preserving those traditions and laws and anchoring them in the text of the Torah, it was possible to further distinguish Judaism and Christianity, and to claim that an important and intrinsic part of the original covenant was totally unknown to Christianity. Torah was more than the 5 books of Moses, and only Judaism had all the material. The sages contended that there was more oral material than written Torah, and that God's covenant was made with Israel only for the sake of that which was given orally, thus excluding Christians, who did not possess that oral material. Rabbinic Judaism developed at the same time that early Christianity was changing from a Jewish sect into a separate religion, claiming to be the true Israel. The development of both Midrash and the Mishnah provided a clear differentiation between the two faiths, emphasizing both the sacredness of the Torah and the existence of extra-biblical Jewish teachings. For the same reason, Akiva was also concerned to see to it that translations of the Bible reflected the interpretations of the sages, thus further rabbinizing, or Judaizing the text. His disciple Aquila, a convert to Judaism, translated the Bible into Greek in a way that corrected many of the passages in the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation, that was in general use at the time, passages that might have led to Christian conclusions, or that represented alternative readings to the Masoretic, authoritative Hebrew text. Aquila's new Greek translation of the entire Bible instead reflected Akiva's interpretations.
So we see in Hammer that Aquila's translation was a means by which Akiba was able to influence the translation of the scriptures into Greek. Now, up until this point in Judaism, the most common used texts, even amongst Hebrew-speaking Jews, was the Septuagint. This is a early pre-Christian Jewish translation. It's the preferred text used in the New Testament. And the Jews of the diaspora, those outside of Judea, this was their Bible, was the Septuagint. The Septuagint, by the way, at this point in time, included the Deuterocanonical books in it. And it also was, in some ways, very Christian friendly. For example, in Isaiah 7:14, the translation in the Septuagint was that a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, where the Hebrew has Alma, which is a bit more vague. So Christians use the Septuagint as its text. In fact, Eastern Christianity today still uses the Septuagint. And so there was a need to replace the Septuagint in order for this newly formed rabbinic Judaism, non-temple centered Judaism, to standardize and become uniform throughout the whole Jewish world. And part of that was the replacement of the Septuagint, and Aquila was one of a few texts that attempted to do that. And as Roberts points out,
a clue to the idiosyncrasies of Aquila's version may be found in the circumstances which gave rise to it. Jewish reports speak of Aquila the proselyte, who was a contemporary of rabbis Eleazar, Joshua, and Akiba, and refer to him as a translator of the Bible. According to Jerome, he was not only a contemporary of Akiba, but also his pupil. Reference has already been made to the strict attention paid by Akiba to the minutiae of the Hebrew text. It was natural, then, that Aquila should show the same meticulous attention to detail when dealing with the text. But in addition, Aquila was convinced, in the same way as his master, of the importance of the Hebrew text, and it has been down that in this translation Aquila was concerned mainly to provide Greek-speaking Jews with a true rendering of the consonantal text of the Hebrew Bible. Its every letter was important, hence the translator's pedantic adherence to it. The spirit which was guiding the scribes of his days in their treatment of the Hebrew text inspired Aquila in his translation of it. Aquila was violently opposed to the Christians, and he did not hesitate to translate some of the messianic passages differently from the translation given by the Septuagint and upheld by the Christian Church. For example, Messiah in passages like Daniel 9 verse 26 he rendered as in Limenos instead of Christus. The debatable Alma of Isaiah 7 verse 14 he translated Ninus, as against E Parthenos of the Septuagint. Nevertheless, because of its extreme correctness and faithfulness to the Hebrew text, Aquila's rendering was respected even by Christians, especially those, such as Origen and Jerome, who had some knowledge of Hebrew, and were willing to recognize its prestige. Among the Jews it quickly found favor, and traces appear in the Talmud that it was used in Jewish synagogues. The fact that manuscripts of the version were found in the Geniza of the Old Cairo synagogue shows that this was so.
So here we have Aquila, who is a disciple of Akiba. Akiba is the one who begins to redefine Judaism as a religion of the book and as a non-cultic entity largely, although he did explore reconstituting the temple with the Bar Kokhba revolt. He also, Aquila reflects his master's hermeneutics in the writings. And as we noted earlier, that since Akiba was at his height in authority during this area where all you have is the Pharisees and the Christians, and Christianity is starting to move from a sect to an independent entity, and Judaism is redefining itself, that it's not surprising to find, as Roberts notes, that the Aquila text translates some passages, probably passages that Christians would use and be favorable to, in a way that's unfavorable to Christians. For example, in the book of Daniel and also in Isaiah 7:14, he departs from the Septuagint to give renderings that, like I said, it would not be very favorable to Christianity. So we have a kind of anti-Christian tendency within the Aquila text. But even more important, not only does the translation reflect the teachings and views and hermeneutics of his master, but it also reflects the canon of his master. In fact, The Akiba Foundation website provides this, and I could provide many other quotes, and I do in my other videos, in regards to Akiba closing the rabbinic canon.
Akiva was instrumental in drawing up the canon of the Tanakh. He protested strongly against the canonicity of certain of the Apocrypha, the wisdom of Sirach. Akiva's utterance reads, "He who reads aloud in the synagogue from books not belonging to the canon, as if they were canonical," etc. But he was not opposed to a private reading of the Apocrypha, as is evident from the fact that he himself makes frequent use of Sirach. Akiva stoutly defended, however, the canonicity of the Song of Songs and Esther. Aquila, meanwhile, was a disciple of Akiva, and under Akiva's guidance, gave the Greek-speaking Jews a rabbinical Bible. Akiva probably also provided for a revised text of the Targums, certainly, for the essential base of the Targum Onkelos, which in matters of halakha reflects Akiva's opinions completely.
So, is the Aquila translation a friend or a foe of the Deuterocanon? Well, it's true, it would be a foe in that it doesn't include the Deuterocanonical books or the so-called Apocrypha. That's absolutely true. On the other hand, once you understand the background of the Aquila text, how close it was for the establishment of the rabbinic Bible. Again, this would be within the first couple of decades of the second Christian century under Rabbi Akiba, and you understand Akiba's role and how Aquila's text reflects that role. It's no surprise at all that these books were not included because it reflects the new norm, the new canonical norm that was established by Akiba in the second Christian century. So, if anything, the Aquila text tells us accurately what the rabbis in the early second century understood was part of the canon, but it doesn't explain the canon of the Christians. And that ultimately, for Christian viewers, that's the ultimate question, is which books did Christ and his apostles hand on to the church to be read as sacred scripture? The Aquila text doesn't give us any information on that. And so we'll just park it right there. Hopefully you enjoyed it and this was informative for you. By the way, while you're here, if you like our videos, please do the thumbs up, like, subscribe, leave some comments. That helps expand our outreach, and truly appreciate it. Until next time, I'm Gary Machuda. Thank you for watching.